All right. Well, good afternoon or good evening, depending on which time zone you're in. We thank you for joining us today to walk along with our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people to really talk and explore how to support culturally safe care, specifically culturally safe healthcare. I'm Josh Gregan, and I want to start off always with a bit of human being, human doing. And so I'm a white settler of European ancestry. I have the privilege to live, work, and play on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people. I am an uninvited guest on this land, and I continue to appreciate the land for what it represents as the land, but also what it represents as far as culture is concerned. I was privileged to witness a naming ceremony earlier today from, one of my Sean and Heather Atleo, who are friends. And I just continue to appreciate that it's not just about the trees. The trees in the forests are the pharmacies and the grocery stores and the culture that continues to lie within. And so it's an honor to be both an uninvited guest on these lands. They are spectacular lands. I continue to appreciate our Indigenous people have been caretakers and continue to be stewards of the land and ultimately their culture. And that me as a white settler, and we as healthcare providers continue to have ongoing opportunity to learn and grow of what that looks like. And so my own personal journey, I've been a physician in Hope for many years. And like I said before, now live in Victoria. The Hope territory was the Coast Salish, specifically the Staulau Inca Klatma people. And again, in that time that I spent in Hope and continue to work in Victoria and across the province, the stories that I've told of resilience, of hope, of perseverance, of forgiveness, of truth and reconciliation are things that impact me as a person, as a clinician, as a husband, as a father, eventually as an ancestor, although I'm hoping my kids hold off for some period of time. I continue to learn so much from elders and knowledge keepers, and we are very, very privileged today to have both Harley Eagle as well as Avis OBrien. And so we're excited about those opportunities. For context, again, the Joint Collaborative Committees have launched a number of initiatives in partnership with both Indigenous communities to advance cultural safety. This has been in collaboration with Len Pierre Consulting. And again, there has been in the last several months a series of longhouse experiences. I hope some of you have had the privilege and opportunity to do that. Alongside, again, I mentioned Team Atleo, or Sean and Heather Atleo, to deliver the Compassionate Leadership Program for physicians. I want to thank this opportunity. For those of you who attended last time, Harley did a fantastic job of leading us through these educational sessions. And this is obviously the second of 5. And the last one, for those of you who haven't seen, can go back and watch as it's being recorded. That is a reminder that, again, this is being recorded tonight for future reference, but again, affirming that from your perspective. Harley, I will now introduce. Harley Eagle is a Dakota and Ojibwe, a member of the Whitecap Dakota First Nation. For over 20 years, Harley has designed, facilitated workshops and activities that strive and recall and reclaim Indigenous understanding of life. And we are grateful for the opportunity to learn from him. I've had the privilege many times to learn from Harley and continue to learn something new every time. As I said before, this is the second of 5, and this one is framed as hearing our history and our stories. We will also have the honor to learn and hear from Nalaga Avis OBrien as she shares her personal stories about how to deliver trauma-informed healthcare. Avis is a Haida Kwakwaka'wakw artist and land-based cultural empowerment facilitator. She's a weaver, teacher, dancer, singer, and land-based cultural empowerment facilitator. I've also had the privilege to listen to Avis before. I know that you are in for a very quiet, very thoughtful consideration of care and the amazing story that Avis shares. And so we are honored to have both Avis and Harley join us today. And with that, I will turn it over to continue to share stories and the journey towards truth and reconciliation.
Thank you so much, Josh. And thank you everybody for being here. I'm going to say a few words here and give a bit of more background around foundational understandings of Indigenous cultural safety, just as a review. But we want to make sure we get to Avis Nalaga's presentation here in about 12 minutes or so. And I really want to thank Nalaga for being here, for accepting the invitation to share in this space. And it's really an honor to turn this over to Nalaga for a few moments here before she starts with her presentation, because she's going to get us started in a really good way by offering a song to get us settled and to set the tone for our time together. So Nalaga, I'll turn it over to you.
Kayla Kessler, Harley, thank you so much. Really grateful to be here and I'm calling in from the unceded territory of the Comox First Nation. And I specifically want to acknowledge the tribes of the Pentlatch, Aiksin, Comox, and Satlut, and thank the Comox people for taking such good care of these lands since time immemorial. We're going to spend tonight, in our thinking mind, and I'm going to invite us. I'm going to be sharing a song, and I'm going to be inviting us to shift our awareness from above the neck, where we as human beings spend the majority of our time, to below the neck, into our bodies. And the invitation is just to be curious. It's an invitation to notice if you feel anything happening in your body when you hear the drum beat. And the song I'm going to share comes from my nation, the Ligwith, which is one of the 17 tribes of the Kwakwaka'wakw. And it's a gratitude song. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm grateful to be part of this work. And this is a song to honor each and every person here in this space for coming and taking time out of your day to be here. So your eyes can be closed or your eyes can be open, keeping in mind that you have choice in everything that we do together today. And yeah, just an invitation to be curious what you feel in your body when you hear the drum beat. Yo, 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 So Kayla Kessler means thank you, and Kwakwala, thank you for taking that time to shift our awareness into our bodies and just notice what's happening in our body. So Kayla Kessler, and I'll pass it back to you, Harley.
Thanks so much, Nalaga, and thank you so much for that beautiful song. And I really appreciate how you spoke to moving from just our minds, but into other parts of our body as well. And really, this work is about relationships and relationship building, but from a place of authenticity, which requires us to be connected to our full body as well in order to have that authenticity. And so we're here to speak to some of those elements and understandings, but in the midst of our stories as well. But I just wanted to share something really quickly, just to say, in terms of relationship, I really want to thank the Indigenous physicians that help to guide what we're doing here for these sessions. And we talked a lot about just exactly what Nalaga is saying about recognizing that we're more than just our minds. That absolutely is a part of who we are, but we're also body and emotion and spirit and all of those elements. And so this medicine wheel that you see on your screen, really that's the foundation to our process. It's often the foundation to the flow of our meetings. We've been spending time setting a good tone here in this moment. And that's a part of the recognizing how all of us, our beings are connected, and then we're connected to each other and then to the world around us as well. And so for the first session that we gathered here, and some of you were with us, we did a lot of work around kind of foundational understandings of Indigenous cultural safety. And for this session, we're going to be connecting Indigenous cultural safety to the stories of our lived experience, and then understanding trauma and examples of Indigenous culturally safe practice. And I really smiled hard just as I saw two good friends, both Nalaga and myself, joined our session, two physicians, your colleagues, Dr. Ral Gupta and Dr. Dana Hubler, have joined us. And so I want to recognize them. And not only because of the shared journey that we're on and the work that we do together and the things that we're building together, the friendship that we're growing as well, but also because they're going to be presenting in future sessions with us too. So I want to acknowledge them that they're here. And when we recognize friends and we recognize allies and we recognize relatives, it helps us to feel both a sense of grounding, and also there's also a level of integrity that increases because we want to be our best for our relatives and for our friends. And so I want to acknowledge the several of the Indigenous physicians that help to guide this work, and then also our friends here, Dr. Gupta and Dr. Hubler that are joining us. So that's what we're going to do here. And I'm just going to say a few words here before I turn it over back to Nalaga. I want to just think about the word protocol. So that's kind of what we've been doing here for the last 15 minutes or so. The protocols that Josh really did a good job of bringing us in, of acknowledging the land and relationships, and even how the session came into being. All of those things we can call protocols. We're taking care of some things at the beginning. And for Indigenous people, it's, Nalaga shared a beautiful song, and if we were in a setting where it was a bigger, maybe perhaps public setting, there would be a lot more elements to the protocols in place, like words of wisdom from elders and knowledge keepers, even more sharing of song, perhaps dance and ceremony, prayers, all of those things, sharing of food, and then introduction to one another as well. All of those things we can call protocols. And I think I mentioned this last session too, that I like the word protocol because if you look at the root of this word, it literally translates into first glue. So it's referencing the bookbinding process or the putting together of important documents. And when I heard that about the word protocol meaning first glue, that made sense to me as an Indigenous person, because that's why we do those customs and protocols. It's to activate the glue that holds us together as individuals and that expands into our whole being, just as Nalaga was encouraging us to move beyond just our minds. But it helps, all of those things help to activate our full being and then our connections with one another and the world around us as well. And we certainly need that kind of glue that holds us together because of everything that we're carrying in this moment. It's the end of a long day for many of us as well. So it's good to acknowledge those things that perhaps we're carrying. It's good to notice how our bodies are showing up, how our spirits are showing up, how our emotions are showing up in this moment. And for a lot of us, we're carrying a lot. And certainly for you folks, with the way that you've had to live your lives and do your work over the last 3 years in terms of this pandemic, you are carrying a lot in this moment. So it's good to notice that, and that helps us to remember to be kind and gentle with ourselves and to be kind and gentle with each other as well. And then the nature of this talk can be difficult. The stories that you're going to hear today, and the connections that Nalaga makes to the systemic nature of oppression as well aren't always easy to hear. And then certainly for those of us that are Indigenous, that these stories are familiar to us and to our families, it can be a source of triggering. So we ask people to do those things that help you to stay present, breathe and do those activities and techniques that help you to stay present. And that helps you to be kind to yourself and to others as well. And then we always like to remind people that everything that we're talking about and doing here, really you can look to the TRC calls to action, the In Plain Sight report, other commissions and reports like the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. We pay attention to those documents and to those recommendations and shape the way that we do our work, because that's what we're being called to do all across this province and this country. So in this moment, we are paying attention to those calls. So we are in an act of truth and reconciliation and addressing racism by what we're learning and how we're learning together. And then, as I mentioned earlier as well, too, the way that we think about this work, often, we can say that it comes from Indigenous worldview, this recognizing that there's a big picture and that everything is connected. So it's important to understand those connections. And that's the way we do this work, by taking a big picture view or a systems view to understand our circumstances. And that also includes the structures of oppression as well, the colonial structures that are still on our landscape or that have come onto our landscape. So it's important to understand those dynamics. So that's a big part of cultural safety as well, to understand the dynamics and patterns of oppression as well. And then I always like to share this picture. It's referencing Mount Fuji in Japan. And I share this picture because for those of you that are from other parts of the world, probably have your own experiences of colonization as well, or you know the history of the lands that you're from. And so oftentimes folks from other parts of the world see a similarity with their own experiences. And that's important to notice. And then your stories become very important in this as well, because of those connections to the global phenomena of colonization. And so we're going to be sharing today. Nalaga certainly shares from a place of vulnerability. And so we want to recognize that vulnerability is so profound and so important to this work of Indigenous cultural safety. So at the end of the session, there will be an opportunity for you to share and ask questions and make comments. You can put those questions in the chat if you would like, and we'll collect them and strive to address them at the end. But oftentimes those questions come from a place of vulnerability. And certainly you'll hear vulnerability in action here tonight. And we know that oftentimes shame holds us back from engaging. We do all sorts of things to push the shame away, or we feel that shame. And so we do things to avoid these conversations. But we know that vulnerability is the antidote to shame. It starts to melt shame if we can share from a deep place and share with one another. And it's also the gateway to creativity and innovation and joy and authenticity. So we have to look at these difficult circumstances in order to get to that place of creativity and innovation and a place of change in our lives. And so another aspect to all of this, and actually when we meet with Dr. Gupta at our next session, he'll talk a lot more about understanding the connections to our bodies, as will Nalaga tonight as well. But self-regulation becomes really important. And so do those things tonight. As you hear the stories, you might end up being somewhat triggered, or your mind may go to a place because of the similarities in the stories that you're hearing and based on your own experiences. So it's important to stay regulated. So do those activities that and then that's helpful for how we show up together. If we're all striving to be self-regulated, we can influence each other in terms of co-regulation. And then somatics. I like to share this, in the work that we do, because we're seeing that the leading edge of work like anti-racism work is recognizing how it impacts our bodies, how we're all impacted living in this system of colonialism and racism. It has an impact on us. So it's important to understand that and to respond in a way that changes the way that our bodies have been trained in and conditioned in this colonial world. So somatics is very important to this work as well. So I'm just going to move through a couple slides here very quickly, because it's important to get to Nalaga's presentation, and she'll speak to many of these same concepts that you'll see here. Cultural safety is not only about cultural awareness and sensitivity and that way of practicing being culturally aware. Competency, sometimes it's called. That's a part of cultural safety, but it's also there's also the aspect of looking at the power imbalances found within our healthcare structures or any systems, where we can start to address those patterns so that we can develop systems that are free of racism and discrimination.
Harley, may I just interrupt? I'm sorry. We're not seeing the slides. If you can move it to presenter mode, and then we can see what you're seeing.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. There we go. Well, I see you. I don't see the slides.
Yeah, and I've been having trouble with Zoom these last few days. It has really let me down. So let me see, what are you seeing now?
Now we see the slides, I think, how you want us to.
Okay. All right.
Cultural safety, origins, and defined. Is that what you'd like us to see?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
we're on the same page, everybody.
Okay, thanks everybody for thank you for letting me know. So cultural humility is the process of getting to this place of cultural safety where we can address power imbalances. And we need a process that's meaningful and helpful and safe as well to address these big things that we need to address. And so what we say in the learning process of cultural safety is that we have to start from a place of knowledge, but not just knowledge, just as Nalega said at the beginning too, that we have to move it to, understanding, and understanding means in the midst of. So we have to find ourselves in the midst of, we have to feel, all of these things and recognize that our emotions are part of all of this. So not just knowledge, it's also more than that. And then that helps us to understand the skills that we might require, like anti-racism or trauma-informed practice or compassionate care, all of those things that Josh mentioned that you're learning about. All of those are very important in terms of the skills that we need to address the legacy and the ongoing reality of colonial systems. And then that helps us to figure out a way forward. But we have to take those steps before we move to action and allow for the work that we can do together and figuring out together and allowing for emergent action to come into being as well. And then we also recognize that we have to build a safe container that can hold this work because it isn't easy, it's uncomfortable. So we have to have that helpful process that can get us there. And I just have a couple more thoughts to share here. Yeah, just 2 more slides here. So when we're talking about systemic racism, we want people to understand, and the work of cultural safety is getting people to a place that helps us to understand that racism isn't only about those ugly interactions between individuals. It's a part of it, but it's much more than that as well. And so we have to look at the power that has created things like the Indian Act or the reserve system or the doctrine of discovery or Indian hospitals. And we could go on and on in terms of what's been in place for hundreds of years that has given rise to these systems, these complex systems of social and political gears that put these things in place in the lives of Indigenous people. And the problem is when we normalize them or that we don't even see these things in our systems, it shapes the way and influences us and conditions us to live in this society in such a way that we end up treating people in harmful ways, or that we see each other as of lesser value or more value than others. And then the last slide that I'll share with you here is where we try to get to in the work of cultural safety is really kind of found in this quote that comes from Indigenous activists from Australia. They say, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. So that's the work of cultural safety, is to help us to understand these systems of oppression that surround all of us, and that all of us are impacted by these systems. So it's not just about helping Indigenous people, it's also recognizing that we're all tied up in these systems that requires all of us to be liberated from. So with that, I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to turn it over to Nalega for presentation.
Thank you so much, Harley. I love hearing you talk about all the things that you share. It's very powerful, and I learn something every time I hear you share. Thank you so much for the work you do in our community and in our world. So I'm gonna start by sharing my screen. So this presentation is called Healing Through Land and Culture. We'll be together until 5:30. And I'm just going to introduce myself. I realized I didn't introduce myself initially. So yo Kayla Kessler Daukola, Nugwa Nalaga, Gayuklin La Kwakwakiwak Get Ligwith Dao. Kaukuna Hinu Dikian. My English name is Avis OBrien, and my Kwakula name is Nalaga, which translates to bringer of daylight. And my Haida name is Kaukuna, which translates to sitting great, or one who sits great. And I come from the Kawastastath Eagle clan in Haida Gwaii and the Giggle Gumnat Lima of the Ligwith Dao, which is one of the 17 tribes of the Kwakwakiwak. Also, in the nature of this conversation we're going to have, and the topic of cultural safety, important for me to acknowledge the intersections of marginalization and privilege that I've inherited through my ancestry. So I identify as a white passing cisgendered Indigenous woman. I live with an invisible mental illness and an invisible physical disability. So I look like a well able-bodied person, and I have some pretty significant struggles that I live with. And those struggles are very much rooted in what we're going to be talking about today, which is Canada's ongoing attempted colonial genocide, residential schools, and colonization is really the root of my physical and mental health struggles. I'm also a mother. I have 2 beautiful children, and I love being a mom. It's hard work, and I'm really focused on breaking those intergenerational cycles of trauma for my children. And I'm gonna go to the next slide. I already acknowledged the territory that I'm on. So in this session, I'm going to be sharing my story, which highlights the intersectionality of colonial genocide, systemic separation from Indigenous identity, land, and culture, and the mental health, physical health, and addiction struggles that come as a result of these facets. Also discussed is how we as Indigenous people, or anybody, not just Indigenous people, how people can heal through a connection to land and culture. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll be sharing some tangible tools for offering healthcare that's rooted in belonging and cultural safety. So some of the things that I share in my story may be activating. I'm moving away from using the word trigger because trigger can remind people of gun violence and things that activation just seems like a gentler word. But in my conversation, you may have thoughts or feelings that come up that may be uncomfortable. And so it's important to put that activation in here, and we're all here to support one another. So learning objectives. So there's just gonna spend a little bit of time sharing about these. So the first intention is to learn tangible tools for offering healthcare that is rooted in belonging and cultural safety. I feel that belonging is an antidote to the systemic separation that Indigenous people are currently living with. So systemic separation referring to the laws that the federal government enacted to oppress and marginalize Indigenous people, and to basically strip us of all of the things that made us healthy and whole as a people in order for our lands to be profited off of and colonization to be successful. So belonging is a very powerful antidote to that systemic separation. And the second objective is to learn or deepen our empathy as a way of creating safety for Indigenous folks in the healthcare system. We do continue to lose lives at the hands of racism in the healthcare system, and all systems, actually. I appreciate that Harley talks about all of systems of oppression, because it's not just healthcare that we lose people to racism. It's the judicial system, child welfare, all of the systems that were created from colonialism. We continue to lose people to racism. And empathy is one of the ways that I see as a very powerful antidote to racism. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. The third objective is to strengthen our knowledge of ancestral land-based healing modalities. These are the things that kept Indigenous people healthy and balanced in body, mind, and spirit since time immemorial. And it's exactly the reason why these parts of ourselves were targeted during the process of colonization. Because in order for colonization to be successful, our spirits needed to attempt to be broken. And how they did that was making it illegal for us to engage in these practices that make us strong. So I'm really passionate about sharing these in the hope that we can reimagine a healthcare system that actually works and addresses the root causes of people's illnesses, not just offering band-aid solutions. So ancestral land-based healing practices, I think, offer a very holistic way of looking at wellness. And then the final learning objective is to connect with the power of co-regulation to assist in trauma recovery for our Indigenous relatives. Co-regulation is a very simple, very, very powerful tool that I'm passionate about infiltrating into the world because it has saved my life from the spirit of suicide. And I'm going to be sharing a little bit about that throughout the presentation. So I'm really passionate about this practice and how we can bring that into our work. So the agreements are sort of the vessel and how we will hopefully achieve some of these learning objectives or goals. So the first one I wanted to put forward was offering unconditional positive regard for each other. So unconditional positive regard is really seeing each and every person in this space that we're all showing up in the best ways that we know how with the tools that we have. And positive regard isn't withdrawn from a person if they say something that we don't agree with, or some people showing up in a way that is irritating to us, that we just offer that unconditional positive regard. And one of the ways that we can achieve unconditional positive regard is through something called compassionate witnessing, or compassionately witnessing each other. And compassionate witnessing is listening less with our ears and more with our bodies and our hearts, and really reflecting on what's resonating within our own bodies and reflecting that back. So we will have time at the end for questions and dialogue. So really important agreements for when we engage in that interaction. Confidentiality. So whatever I share, I'm an open book. I'm here to share a bit of my story. And so I don't need to be kept confidential, but in order to create this safe container for this work to happen, really important that if there's anything that folks share after the presentation, we keep that confidential. And finally, take space and make space. So there's some of us who are more inclined to speak up and use our voice when there's invitations for sharing, and then there's some of us who are less inclined. And we want to hear from everybody. So it's an invitation to just be mindful of how much space are we taking up, and are we making enough room for others to share. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about my childhood and some of the privilege that I was born into. So I say I'm not in my home. I'm used to doing this work from the comfort of my home, and I don't have internet for the second day in my home. So I don't have my nice comfy chair. So you might see me moving around a little bit because I'm not as comfortable as I usually am. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about the privilege that I was born into. So I was born into a body with white skin, and that has awarded me a tremendous amount of privilege to move through the world in a way that's provided me a lot of ease. My Indigenous ancestry comes from my mother. She is Haida and Kwakwaka'wakw, and she visibly looks Indigenous. And her experience in the world has been very different than mine. The way she's treated people who are visibly Indigenous, the way that they're treated by these systems that are rooted in racist ideology is very different than somebody who's white passing. And so that's the first one I want to acknowledge. And I also just want to share that I use that's maybe one of the reasons why I do this work, and I take that privilege seriously, and I use that privilege to be part of creating change in the lives of Indigenous people. I was also born into economic privilege. So my family wasn't wealthy in any sense, but my dad was born in Dublin, Ireland during the potato famine, and he grew up in severe poverty. He immigrated to Canada when he was a little boy, and again, still living in poverty. Whatever happened in my dad's family when they were little kids was so bad that they dispersed. And I have aunts and uncles that I've never met. I've got cousins that I've never met, because whatever happened in their childhood, they don't want anything to do with each other. And I'm in the process of trying to find those family members so that I can build relationships with them. So because my dad grew up in such poverty, he worked really hard. So he hitchhiked across Canada from Kingston, Ontario. He ended up in Alert Bay. which is very random. He loved fishing and he loved being on the water. So he ended up in Alert Bay, which is a very prominent fishing community back in the 60s or the 70s. And that's where he met my mom. And so he provided a lot. He worked really hard his whole life to provide opportunities that he never had, which leads into the next one, which I grew up having access to recreation. So I grew up, as soon as we could walk, my dad threw us on skis and threw us down the mountain. And we spent all of our weekends on Mount Cain and learning how to ski. And then as soon as we could we're old enough to snowboard, we switched to snowboarding. Now as a parent, I'm realizing what a privilege it is to grow up on the mountain and to have access to snow sports. You have to have money and you have to have an able body to be able to teach your kids. And there's a lot of privilege in that, being able to spend all that time in the mountains. I didn't appreciate it at the time, but now I'm seeing what a blessing that was, and something that a lot of Indigenous children don't have the opportunity. So important for me to acknowledge the privileges that I was born into. And I've chosen this photo of myself because this is around the age of age 4. It's around the age where I experienced something traumatic that really changed the trajectory of my life. And what I'm going to share is, this is an epidemic in Indigenous communities. So, and what I'm going to share is about childhood sexual abuse. And when I say this is an epidemic, it's still going on. In my family alone, like 90% of us have been sexually abused. So if you weren't sexually abused, you're sort of the anomaly. And maybe that's because we grew up in Alert Bay, where St. Mike's residential school was, that abuse was so prominent. So it was about the age of 4 where that trauma, I experienced that trauma. And usually it's by people who are closest to us, family members, people that you're supposed to trust, that you would never think would do that. And that was the case in my experience. It was my mom's brother. He lived next door to us, spent a lot of time there. And it's an epidemic. And I've got photos here of St. Michael's Residential School in Alert Bay. And I have a really hard time calling these schools because they were not schools. These were genocidal torture institutions designed to eradicate Indigenous people from the planet so that colonization could be successful and they could profit and get rich off of our territories. These were the institutions it was a genocidal tool. And sexual abuse obviously was very, very prominent in these institutions. And I think that's why it continues to be an epidemic in our communities. And the systems in place that are supposed to keep children safe, they're broken and they don't work. And I'm experiencing that right now, where a little person in my neighborhood was being abused by a residential school survivor. And I made the police report and I made the MCFG report. And they said, sorry, there's not enough evidence. And now that person works in the school. And again, unless you have a police report, like a person's been charged, there's nothing. So then this person is now working with kids. So it's just these systems that are supposed to keep children safe, they don't work. They're very broken. And so I grew up in a lot of privilege, and I also inherited the trauma of Canada's colonial genocide through these institutions. And there's other things that I can talk about in my childhood that really stem from colonization and genocide. Being exposed to domestic violence. My family was successfully assimilated in the sense that successfully assimilated and successfully colonized in the sense that I didn't grow up with a connection to my identity. I didn't grow up with a connection to the land, my culture. So like successfully colonized. But really that experience of childhood abuse is what I'm going to focus on. And I'm going to share a little bit about somatically and physiologically what happens in the wake of something traumatic like that. And I'm going to use the work of Dr. Stephen Porges. He's developed the Polyvagal Theory. And this theory really has helped me to understand myself, my experience, and how I've shown up in the world. It's helped me to have a lot more compassion for myself. So when as a little person, I'm going to use the experience of me being abused as a little person. When we're experiencing something traumatic like that, there's 3 states that our nervous system can be, and that's what you see on the image on the left here. So these 3 nervous system states, our autonomic nervous system is an upside down triangle at the base of the brainstem, and it works as a hierarchy in the sense that the higher up you go on the triangle, the more access to your prefrontal cortex you have, which is where rational thinking, executive functioning, planning for the future, all of those things exist. So when we're at the top of the triangle, we have access to this part of the brain. The lower you go down on the triangle, the smaller it gets, the less access we have to this part of the brain. This part of the brain goes offline when we're in fight or flight or when we're in dorsal vagal. So as a little person experiencing trauma like that, the first sort of line of defense is our social engagement system. So using our face, our voice to navigate a threat like that, maybe talk our way out of it. And when that doesn't work, we move down into the triangle, into fight or flight. And in Dr. Stephen Porges's Polyvagal Theory, he calls it sympathetic activation. So then we try to fight our way out of it, or we try to run. 4-year-old girl, adult male, you're not running or getting out of that situation. So then what our nervous system does is we move into the last line of defense, which is in Polyvagal Theory, he calls it dorsal vagal. And that's at the bottom of the triangle in the red zone. In order to survive something traumatic like that, we abdicate from the body in order to survive that experience. And that I'm grateful that my body did that. That helped me to survive something traumatic like that. But that abdicating and cutting off from the body, the part of the brain that's responsible for integrating the psychological aspects of that trauma, the thoughts, the feelings, the emotions, the limbic system, things don't get processed properly. And as a result of that, we're left with PTSD. And so I've got here, my life has been sort of oscillating between sympathetic activation and dorsal vagal. I've had very little access to my social engagement system. And so these are the things that don't feel good. As you can see some of the words here: rage, anger, panic, trapped, helpless. Like, these don't feel good. And these are the symptoms that lead people to reach outside of themselves to regulate their nervous system. These are signs of a dysregulated nervous system. And then if we don't have ways to self-regulate, or we don't have parents or adults in our life to support us, then we start reaching for whatever it is: substances, food, staying so busy. This is one of my current ones: stay so busy that you just avoid having to feel, and then self-harm. So I'm really grateful for Dr. Stephen Porges's work, because this is, it helped me to understand myself and my experiences. So as a little person, I was living with a dysregulated nervous system, so oscillating between the red and the yellow, between sympathetic activation and dorsal vagal, not feeling good. I was one of those kids that had my hair over my face, head down all the time. I couldn't look at people in the eye. Just deep shame, deep self-hatred and shame that I carried. And my parents did the best they could, but the best they could wasn't very good. And that's the reality. I love my parents, but that generation didn't have access to the resources that we have access to today. We have there's program, like the fact that we get to talk about these things in residential schools isn't a secret. That the government tried to hide residential schools for a very long time. And now it's open. It's something that we're talking about. Residential school survivors and their descendants have access to free therapy. These are things that my ancestors didn't have access to. So as a little person, I was living with a dysregulated nervous system, and I didn't have the support that I needed. And so I found ways to feel better as a little kid. And so some of those things I shared on the other slide, those are things that I found as a little person, as young as 5 years old. I remember waking up early in the morning before anybody else was awake, and getting a bag of chocolate chips and eating the whole thing. So that changes how you feel. and then I remember also sort of disassociating or finding that relief or just an escape from my internal reality and regulating or disassociating, I guess, from reality through screens. And my dad was really adamant that we spent a lot of time outside on the land and being active. So didn't have a lot of time on screens, but whenever I got that time, it was like I remember that feeling really good. As I got older, at the age of 10, I discovered self-harm, and cutting became my main way of regulating my nervous system. So again, if we look at that, think about that triangle and the symptoms of the red zone and the yellow zone: anger, rage, disassociation, hopeless, trapped. These are things that don't feel good. So cutting and burning and other forms of self-harm, they're a really effective tool for regulating one's nervous system, for taking that internal pain, turning it into something physical. And so it's a really effective tool. And that became my main way of coping. And my parents didn't know that I was doing that. I don't think anybody knew that I was doing that. But that sort of became my main way of regulating my nervous system. And at the age of 10, I mean, I didn't realize that at the time, but that's just like a little baby. And I work in the field of suicide prevention now, and this is showing up for kids as young as 8 years old. I've got people saying we need suicide prevention programs for 8-year-old children. And so, and I know that sexual abuse is one of the most prominent things that leads us to self-harm. So as I continued to get older, at the age of 12, I discovered substances. And when I discovered substances, that became my main way of regulating my nervous system, my main way of escaping my reality, coping with my internal experience of pain and shame. And I want to introduce here the work of Riel Dupuy-Rossi, who is an Algonquin Mohawk psychotherapist. And they're really leading the way in looking at mental health and addiction and suicidality from a social justice lens. And so Riel talks about addiction, mental health, and suicidality as normal human responses to carrying the burdens of 500 plus years of attempted and ongoing colonial genocide. So the language is very specific. We don't talk about genocide as if it's something that happened during the residential school era or something that happened 200 years ago. This is something that is very present, it's attempted, and it's ongoing. This is woven into the fabric of our lives as Indigenous people. We can see this in the opioid epidemic, the missing and murdered Indigenous women's epidemic, the fact that there's 3 times as many children in foster care today than there was at the height of the residential school era. The missing and murdered Indigenous women, in Manitoba, 4 Indigenous women were just murdered. And the RCMP's response is, yeah, we think their body remains are in a landfill, but we're not going to take the time to find those bodies. That's an example of how this stuff is still very prominent and it's woven into the fabric of our lives. This isn't something that happened a long time ago. We're dealing with it still today. And so I appreciate Riel and the way that they frame how we look at mental health, addiction, and suicidality, because it's a very non-pathologizing way of looking at it. Where pathologizing would be to locate the problem within the person, which, I have to mention 12-step programs here because that's the most widely accepted free resource for people who struggle with addiction. And what they tell you there is if you struggle with addiction or substances or alcoholism, you're using substances because you have a disease that's locating the problem within the person. And I think that's really problematic. And there's absolutely no science to support that from my perspective. There is science to support that trauma is the root of addiction. And these are all normal human responses. So at the age of 10, I found substances, and that became my main way of regulating, of escaping those uncomfortable feelings that I was living with. My addiction started at the age of 12, and I lived in Courtenay at the time, in Comox territory. And my teenage years were spent in and out of the psych ward. So I was what they call, it's a term I recently discovered, they call a frequent flyer. And I shared that with a woman who was working up in Port Hardy in a hospital. And she said, I used that term there, and I was kindly educated on the fact that they don't use that term in that hospital. We refer to folks coming in as friendly faces. And I said, oh, wow, that's a beautiful way of changing that language, because I think that language is really problematic. So I was a frequent flyer. As an Indigenous youth, I was in and out of the emergency room. I was always under the influence of substances, and I was always for suicidal behavior. So either overdosing on pills or cutting to the point of needing stitches. And I'm gonna come back at the end of the presentation and talk a little bit about, unpack some of these interactions in the hospital that perpetuated trauma, and some of those interactions in the hospital that created safety for me to continue accessing support. Sort of fast forward till I was halfway through grade 12, and it was my last suicide attempt, and my parents didn't know what, they were sort of at a loss. They didn't know what to do with me. So they sent me, and they had connected me with John Howard. I had a counselor. They had tried, you know, they recognized that I was really suffering and tried to get me into counseling and such, but nothing was working. And so they sent me to live in Vancouver with my sister. And Vancouver exposed me to the downtown east side. And the downtown east side is where Indigenous people go to live out the impacts of colonization. My great-grandparents, Jeff Wallace and Ruby Simeon, my great-grandfather was a hereditary chief of the Ligwith and my great-grandmother was a matriarch, the oldest of 15 children in our clan in Haida Gwaii. And they lived the last 30 years of their life in an SRO in the Dotson Hotel in the downtown east side. Again, that generation didn't have access to the supports, and healing from trauma is a privilege, and it's a privilege that my ancestors did not have an opportunity to engage in. So I found myself in the downtown east side as an Indigenous youth, and at the end of my addiction, I was homeless, and I was an IV heroin user, and I was surviving my addiction through the sex trade. And I want to note here, not everybody who's experienced early childhood sexual abuse is going to end up doing survival sex work. But the amount of people who are doing survival sex work that have a history of early childhood sexual abuse, those two things are inextricably connected. And for me, that is why I ended up there. Something happened, and I had withdrawn from heroin cold turkey once before. I was showed up at my uncle's house, and he was very sick with cancer. My grandpa was also living there, dying of cancer, and they had a new baby. But I showed up on his doorstep, and he let me in, and my family supported me to withdraw from heroin. I was clean for 18 days, and then I got addicted again. And ended up back on the street. Something happened when I was in an alley. I was coming down, I was very sick from heroin withdrawal. Something happened while I was coming down, really suffering. And it was like an outside spiritual force that entered my body and allowed me to see and feel and think that this can't be it for my life. This can't be it for like what I'm here on the earth to do. There has to be more for my life. And whatever that energy was, allowed me to get up out of that alley, and I hitchhiked to my mom's house. And I have emotion here because of the amount of Indigenous people that we've lost. And this statistic, this is an old statistic from like 6 months ago. So the amount of people that are dying to opioid drug poisoning, I can't keep up with the statistics. About 6 months ago, the statistics were 30,000 people in Canada have died of drug poisoning. Out of those 30,000, 25,000 of those have been Indigenous. In my community, we're losing chiefs, knowledge keepers, like important people in our community. People do not deserve to die because they haven't yet found another way to cope with their trauma. And that's what the emotion is, because of I can't keep up with the grief. I don't even go to funerals anymore because they're happening all the time. So that energy allowed me to get up out of that alley, and I hitchhiked to my mom's house. She was living in Courtney, and my mom allowed me to stay with her, and I got on the methadone maintenance program. And so what methadone did for me was it allowed me to escape the cycle that I was in. So I was in a very bad cycle of, at this point, I didn't want to be doing anything anymore. I did not want to be using, and I definitely did not want to be doing survival sex work. But in order to not be sick from heroin withdrawal, I needed money, and that's what I was doing to get money. And so it was a vicious cycle that I didn't want to be doing, but I had no way out. And so methadone provided a way out of that. It provided an opportunity for me to stop hurting my body. I'm a strong advocate for harm reduction, and I'm a strong advocate for safe supply, because people don't deserve to die because they have not yet found another way to cope with trauma. So harm reduction saved my life, and this was 17 years ago. So around this time, there wasn't a lot of treatment centers that were supportive of opioid antagonist therapy. Thankfully, I did find one called the Crystal Society in Vancouver, and I spent 18 months there. So from the time I went in to the time I graduated was 18 months. Within that 18-month period, I went to, at the time it was called Aurora, now it's called Heartwood. It's a treatment center for women at the BC Women's Hospital. And in that whole time of treatment, I was never exposed to drumming, singing, elders, smudging, nothing. There was this, and I mean, this was 17 years ago. Hopefully things are changing now. But I never had access to anything called any cultural teachings during this time. So at about 6 months clean, and in treatment off the street, I got off of methadone, and that was a fight with my doctor. The doctor who was prescribing me methadone kept saying, "No, you just got to stay on. You're gonna relapse. You just stay on." And I have women that I got sober with 17 years ago who are still on Suboxone, and you wouldn't know it from looking at them. They're mothers. They've got good jobs. They're functioning in the world. And that's what they need. And that's great. I'm an advocate for whatever keeps people away from using street substances, because it's a death sentence. It's just a matter of time, the rates in which our people are dying from drug poisoning. But for me, I knew I didn't want that ball and chain. I didn't want it. I didn't want to have to be going to the pharmacy however, I knew in my heart that I was done, and I really had to fight with my doctor. So eventually I was going to the pharmacy for 1 ml, which is like just a dropper on my tongue. The experience of withdrawing from methadone is far easier than withdrawing from heroin cold turkey. It was still very uncomfortable though. So 2 years into my recovery, I was living a good life. I had moved out and I was living on my own, functioning in the world. I had a job, and the spirit of suicide started to show up for me again. And I think the spirit of suicide showed up for me because although I was living a good life, and I was clean and sober and connected to my family, I was still successfully colonized and assimilated, in the sense of I didn't know who I was. I carried shame about my identity. I wasn't connected to the land or my culture in any way. And why I wasn't was because of shame and negative stereotypes. So negative stereotypes that exist in our society are pretty prevalent. The word that you see on the screen is a word that I was called a lot in high school and throughout my life. And this was a barrier to me wanting to connect with my identity and my culture. And because I'm white passing, I got to move through the world pretending I was somebody I wasn't and denying my identity. My sister Megan is the image that you see on the left, and she brought weaving back into our family after it had been asleep for many generations. And I watched her sort of from a distance. I didn't understand what she was doing, again, because I wasn't connected to my culture in any way. And I didn't resonate with what she was doing. I just sort of watched her from a distance and wasn't really interested at all. And what shifted for me was I started attending post-secondary school at Langara, and I started taking Indigenous studies. And in those programs, I started to meet visibly Indigenous women who were empowered and strong and doing amazing things in the world. And these women inspired it. It was my first experience of seeing that being Indigenous wasn't a bad thing. It wasn't what society had portrayed us to be. It was, I had a glimpse of these beautiful, empowered women doing amazing things in the world. And that shifted the narrative for me. Okay, there's something really beautiful and powerful here to connect with. And so because that narrative had changed, I became open to what my sister was engaging in. And so I just want to talk very briefly about the importance of visibility for positive Indigenous identity development. I wonder if that 18 months that I had spent in those residential treatment centers, if I had been exposed to culture, if I would have found my identity sooner, and I probably would have. So I hope that treatment centers are now starting to offer access to these things, because it's really, really important to see Indigenous people in their power, connected to their culture, doing good work in the world, because it acts as an antidote to those negative stereotypes that exist. So because I became open to learning from my sister, it was Christmas time, we were visiting my mom, and she had offered to teach me how to weave. And because that narrative had changed, I said yes. And so she introduced me to the healing powers of cedar. And cedar is the most powerful medicine that we have here on the Northwest Coast. It is the survival of our people depended on this tree. Everything from birth to death came from the cedar tree. So when a baby is in the womb, they are in the spirit world. And the first thing that they touch coming from the spirit world is babies are born onto a cedar woven mat. And then all throughout our life, cedars was everything: clothing, housing, transportation, ceremony, regalia, everything came from the cedar tree, which is why we refer to her as the tree of life. It's also a medicine that absorbs our energy. So our emotional energy, our spiritual energy, the thoughts that we're thinking, what we're feeling, become imbued into the medicine. So when I started working with the bark, these images are of me harvesting cedar bark. When I started to work with that medicine and touch cedar, it started and because she absorbs everything, she started to take from me that shame that had been bred into my ancestors and been bred into me. And it wasn't as tangible or linear as like, okay, I've touched cedar, now I'm not ashamed anymore. But it began the journey. It began the journey of unpacking that shame, and it ignited a fire for me internally to learn about my culture. I wanted more. There was such a loss in there for so many generations of us being denied our culture, denied access to our language, illegal to engage in our culture. And that there was a yearning there, and cedar ignited that fire for me. And so I continued to learn. When I lived in Vancouver and that fire had been ignited, I didn't have access to my Haida or Kwakwaka'wakw culture, but I did have access to powwow culture. And I was brought in to powwow drum circles, Sundance ceremonies, Yowipi ceremonies, sweat lodges. And even though that wasn't my culture, it fed a spiritual need for something that I was craving, that I was yearning for. And I'm a strong advocate, again, for if you're being invited into Indigenous culture and it's not your culture, I strongly believe that it will eventually lead you back to your own. The power of the medicine will lead you back to your own identity and culture. And that's what happened for me. Eventually, I did meet people in Vancouver who were Haida and Kwakwaka'wakw, and I started engaging in drumming and singing and dancing and really reawakening my spirit and reclaiming all of the parts of my identity that had been stolen during the process of colonization. About 5 years into my sobriety, I was working as a street outreach worker for Vancouver Coastal Health. And I worked in the downtown east side, giving out harm reduction tools to young people. And there was a time limit that I could do that work. I lasted about 5 years. And at the end of my work in the downtown east side, I was very, very ill. with PTSD. And I remember sitting at my computer working at Vancouver Coastal Health, and I would just sit there and stare at the screen for, I don't know, maybe I don't know, however long and I was in the bottom of the triangle in dorsal vagal, disassociated. And then I would sort of come to and like, what's going on? Like I knew that things weren't okay. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't functioning. So I took a medical leave from my job and I got on a wait list to get a psychiatric assessment through VGH. And that psychiatric assessment was helpful in the sense that we can't heal from trauma unless we know that we have it. And and I feel kind of betrayed. Well, I feel betrayed by the health system and the mental health and addictions care, because trauma was never a conversation. I didn't even know what it was. I had no idea that trauma was even a thing. And so when I was diagnosed with it, great, that gives me something to work towards healing from. You can't heal from trauma unless you know you have it. So my diagnoses were complex PTSD, depression, anxiety, and traits of borderline. And so where it becomes problematic, and again, I want to introduce again the work of Riel Dupuy-Rossi, who has really developed a beautiful way of looking at mental health struggles. And where it becomes problematic is when those diagnoses start to become our identity. I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm traumatized. That's not who I am as a person. Those are things that come and go from my life. That's not who I am. Those are really normal human responses to what I've been through as a person. So Riel talks about externalizing those pathologies that have been placed on us by the mental health system. And when we do that, when we look at ourselves that we're not these diagnoses, and then we create space to center what was there prior to the abuse, prior to our identity being stolen, prior to the shame. So we create space to center what was there prior to contact. And that's what we want Indigenous people to feel, that that's their identity, not the diagnoses, not our suffering, not our struggles. Because in the same way that intergenerational trauma gets passed down in our genetics and our DNA, so does intergenerational wisdom. So all of the wisdom, the beauty, the strength that my ancestors carried, I also carry that in my being. And that gets translated in the same way that that trauma does. So this has just been a really helpful way of taking that pathology out of people who suffer with mental health struggles. So as I never did go back to work in the addictions field. I guess I'm kind of working in the addictions field now, but I quit my job at VCH and I dropped out of school and I started my business, which was like making cedar jewelry. And my cedar weaving business has now transformed into my current business, which is a consulting business. But it started with me feeling like there had to be more. I didn't want to be working in those spaces anymore. And quitting those jobs and dropping out of school allowed a lot of space for me to continue engaging in land-based healing. And talk therapy maybe it works for some people. I've been in therapy for 17 years and I'll probably continue to be in talk therapy because that's a really great resource for me. But it's not cognitive. It doesn't live in the mind. Because our minds and our bodies are connected, the way that we think and feel does get implicated. But trauma lives in the body. It lives in the nervous system. And you can't talk your way out of it. If you could, I would have by now, because I've spent 17 years doing it. Trauma lives in the body, and the land has the ability to release traumatic memory that gets trapped in our bodies. And really the part of the brain that gets implicated is the limbic system, where we process memory, where our stress responses and our emotions, that's the part of the brain that really gets impacted. So the more we can calm that part of the brain, sort of that bottom-up approach, we create safety and calming in the body, and then we're able to sort of access this part of the brain where we can make sense of traumatic experiences. So these practices that I've listed here, so sweat lodges, cold water cleansing, cedar, drumming and singing, traditional dancing, these are all practices that I engaged in. not knowing what was happening somatically or physiologically, or that I was healing myself from trauma. I did these things because they felt really good, and they helped me they provided a lot of relief. And then last year, I discovered the work of Dr. Michael Yellowbird, who's an Indigenous, he's the Dean of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. His ancestry comes from North Dakota, and I can't remember the name. I feel bad, I can't remember the name of his Indigenous ancestry. But his work, he calls it neurodecolonization. So his life's work has been to study what happens in our brain and in our bodies when we're engaged in our culture. And when I discovered his work, everything just sort of made sense. And that is why those things felt so good. And that is why these are the things that saved my life from trauma. Because we can't talk our way out of it. It needs to be released, and safety needs to be developed in the body. So I could talk about these things and all the sort of vagus nerve being activated and bilateral brain stimulation and, you know, all the calming effects of these, but we don't have time for that. I could spend an hour talking about how healing all of these practices are. But with Dr. Michael Yellowbird's work, we have all the science, all the neuroscience we need to show that culture is healing. And it just makes logical sense that it's been proven with research that addiction, suicidality, mental health struggles is a response, normal response to our identity and our culture being stolen. So moving forward with the healing of Indigenous people, it just makes logical sense that we give people back all of those things that were stolen from them. So I'm going to move into sort of back when I was sharing a little bit about those interactions in the healthcare system that perpetuated trauma. So as a frequent flyer or a friendly face, you know, I was 14, 15, 16 years old and always under the influence and always for suicidal behavior. And I remember those nurses that every time I showed up there, that I was met with feelings of being a burden. I was a burden. What are you doing? Oh, here she comes again. Can you just like get out of here? Is the feeling that I was left with. If you feel like ending your life or have severely harmed yourself, the hospital should be a safe place for you to go to receive care. And when you're met with those kinds of interactions, like coldness, no co-regulation, no smiling face, just closed off body language and just so cold, those really just perpetuate trauma for Indigenous people. And I remember those experiences. And I also remember the experiences that created safety for me to continue accessing care. And I remember the nurses there's one in particular that I remember, her little pink suit and her little black bun on the top of her head. I really wish that I could find her and thank her for, no matter how many times I showed up at the hospital, she never met me with coldness. She met me with empathy and compassion. And like, I remember her like touching my face and like rubbing my head, because I was just a little kid, 14, 15 years old, seriously harming myself. And she just was so kind. And those are the interactions that made it safe for me to continue accessing care. I don't know that I would be alive today without those experiences. And I also want to refer to Luma Medical as a framework that we can integrate into other healthcare settings. So cultural safety begins the moment you walk into Luma Medical. It's an Indigenous family physician clinic run by Dr. Michael Dumont is the medical director and the chief main family physician. We've got it set up in such a beautiful way that when you walk into Luma Medical, cultural safety begins as soon as you walk into the door, because you have access to plant medicines. You could make prayer ties with the 4 sacred medicines. You also have access to an elder at all times at Luma Medical. So if you go there for whatever reason you go to see your family doctor, you can also talk to an elder. So it's a really beautiful framework to work towards. And also with Dr. Dumont, so I'm a person who can't take antidepressants. I've tried every single one made, and they all do the same. And I think this is a really brilliant example of how broken the medical system is, of like, how can we not figure out a medication to help people who are struggling with depression that doesn't make them want to kill themselves? Like, I don't get it. And that's what they all do to me, every single one of them. It changes the chemistry in my brain in the way that I become very unsafe, very dysregulated, and I feel like I can't function. It's very unsafe. I can't take them. Any medication with even if it's at the bottom of the 100 side effects, if it says suicidality, that's what it's going to do to me. Through the process of Dr. Dumont building a relationship with me, and I think he did share with me that we did try, he was one of the physicians that tried some of these medications, and they all did that to me. So at this point in our relationship, he knew that he couldn't just give me an antidepressant and send me on my way. I showed up at his office. I was pregnant with my daughter, and I was visited by the spirit of suicide. I was very dysregulated and I was very suicidal. And he took his doctor's hat off and he dimmed the lights. He sat down beside my bed, not operating from the fee-for-service model, thankfully. Probably spent 45 minutes with me that day. His clinic was very busy, and he saved my life that day, not through sending me off with an antidepressant, through co-regulation. He used his face, his voice, his body language, the words that he was saying to send signals of safety and connection to my dysregulated nervous system to down-regulate, moving me into the top of the triangle, into the green zone, where we feel safe, we feel regulated, we have access to this part of our brain. Created a sense of belonging and connection. And I have had the chance to thank Dr. Dumont for that work that he did in my life, and I'm sure that he continues to help many Indigenous people. So I guess also, I know we're getting close to the end here. Just want to mention too that why co-regulation is such a powerful tool for people who come from backgrounds of complex trauma is because of something called neuroception. So neuroception, we're all doing it. We're doing it right now. It's part of our autonomic nervous system. So we don't have to think about it. It just happens automatically. We're scanning our environment every 4 to 6 seconds for danger, looking for danger. And when you come from complex trauma, like I have, lived experience, early developmental trauma, historical trauma, all the traumas. When you come from that, you have a neuroception of danger. Because of all the trauma you've experienced, you're sort of waiting for it. When's it going to happen? You're just waiting for it, on guard all the time. When a person doesn't come from complex trauma, they have a neuroception of safety, moving through the world, not anticipating something bad's going to happen because their experience in the world has been very different. So using co-regulation, it helps to down-regulate their nervous system and create safety. It creates that the neuroception of danger, sort of bringing the intensity down and creating a safe connection. And that's what Dr. Dumont did for me that day. And I'm incredibly grateful. He saved my life, and he also saved my daughter's life. I was pregnant with my daughter at the time. So very grateful. And this is Luma Medical, and is the framework that I think that we can use to strive towards for cultural safety in the medical system. So a couple of tools for offering healthcare that are rooted in belonging and cultural safety. So the first one I want to put forward is being mindful of our own nervous system and burnout, and acknowledging that people who work in the medical field are burnt out and are trying to operate under a very broken system. So if we aren't able to, and I have empathy, the most empathy for people trying to operate in the current medical system and how broken it is. So if we're not able to offer co-regulation, are we able to take time off to nourish ourselves so we are able to show up for our relatives in that way? Focusing on relationship over content. So relationship is the most important thing. And I always use my current family doctor as an example. So she doesn't have any of the things that I put forward here. She doesn't have Indigenous artwork on the wall. She doesn't have access to an elder. She doesn't have plant medicines. What she does have is a relationship with me. She also doesn't operate from the fee-for-service model. She doesn't kick me out after 5 minutes. She also spends 45 minutes with me when I need it. And has spent the time to develop a relationship with me. So the most important thing is the relationship. Trying not to take things personally. So when people, keeping in mind that triangle, so when people are in the red zone, that's when, in the medical system, you'll see anger outbursts, rage outbursts. These aren't conscious. People aren't doing this because they're, I truly believe, maybe there's some people aren't doing this because they're bad people and they want to cause harm. They're in a trauma response. They're in that sympathetic activation. And to try not take things personally. Offering traditional plant medicine, so cedar, tobacco, sage, and sweetgrass. Offering access to healthy elders for support during mental and physical health struggles. And displaying Indigenous artwork as a way of dismantling negative stereotypes. So again, my current family doctor doesn't have any of these things, but she does have a really positive relation. We have got a great relationship, and that's what's created that safety and belonging. So that brings us to the end of the presentation, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and create a bit of space for any thoughts or questions that people have.
It's Harley here too, and if you would like to put something in the chat as well, we can look to the chat for your question as well. But now is a wonderful opportunity for you to engage with Malaga. Any questions? Any reflections or comments?
I see Leslie has her hand raised.
Yeah,
Right.
thank you, Avis. I've heard you speak before, and I'm as moved each time with you, with the way that you expressed yourself, your experiences, and just your compassion to other human beings for wanting to share those things to create a difference in the world is very meaningful. One of the things I was curious about from your perspective is if you are introducing the topic of cultural safety into, let's say it's a group of family practices, and this is the initial step into this work. How would you approach that? Like, you seem to, when you describe things, you describe things in different levels, and I'm thinking the same thing. Like, is there kind of a phased approach to kind of gently move this training and awareness along in a way that's meaningful, a way that people can learn, and that we can continue to build on? What would be a starting place for you?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you for your kind words, Leslie. And I think I know Dana and Raul are here also, and Harley. So we have started to develop curriculum for physicians, trauma-informed curriculum, sort of educating on the Polyvagal Theory and sort of these somatic impacts. So I'm really excited about that work, because that's going to be accessible to physicians working in rural communities. Sorry, I have a runny nose. It's really bothering me. So I think that is a really important step forward in terms of bringing this knowledge more widely accepted. But I guess in terms of like how to start doing it, I feel like there's going to need to be a policy change. I feel like there's going to need to be whoever is in charge of dispersing the funds, that cultural access to culture is going to need to be like a budget line item. And so I know I did work with a primary care network in Mission, and the lead there was so inspiring. She had like developed this a program where they have elders in their primary care, and I was so inspired because she did that. She acknowledged the importance of it, and she created a little committee and found funding for it, and she worked really hard to create that. But that's not coming from the top. That's like one person saying, we really need this, and how are we going to make it happen? And so I don't know the innovative ways that she found those pockets of funding to have elders as part of primary care. So I don't really know how to start integrating it, because it's going to cost, it's going to be a financial commitment, and it's going to be changing the way that funds are dispensed, that we have to allocate money specifically to provide these things in healthcare. And I'm really happy to see in hospitals that there is that Indigenous imagery, but like, let's have drumming and singing and like all of those things as part of healthcare. So I don't know if I answered your question. But.
You did, thank you.
Is there any other questions?
There's a question, Olga, in the chat about would you please help me better understand the title or role of elder, language keeper, and knowledge keeper?
As different, yeah. So a knowledge keeper would be anybody who has done the Indigenous person who's done the work to obtain knowledge that comes from their ancestry. So land-based knowledge, drumming, singing, any sort of cultural knowledge. What was an elder is somebody who it's not just somebody who's over the age of 60 or something. It's somebody who has done the work, the healing work in their life, to be able to hold space and to offer support to people. And not all people of that age bracket have done that work and want to be called an elder. So an elder is somebody who holds knowledge and has also done the healing work to be able to hold space and be there in a helping way. And then what was the last one?
Language keeper.
Oh, language keeper is another word that we use in our community is language champion, and it's those people who have done the work to revive our languages. And I have the deepest respect for those people, because in Kwakwaka'wakw territory, the language we predominantly speak is Kwakwala, and we've got 2% of our language speakers left. And I'll just share this very quickly because it's really important to me, that there was a study done on First Nations throughout BC. There's a few First Nations in BC that they have 50% or higher Indigenous language speakers who hold a conversational knowledge of their language. In those few communities, their youth suicides dropped to 0. And the communities that had less than 50% language speakers, their youth suicides were 6 times higher. Language is the most powerful protective factor against suicidality. And so I have the deepest respect for those who have kept our languages alive during a time where you were actually imprisoned for speaking your language. So I hope that helps to differentiate those sort of roles.
There's a hand raised, May Henderson, and I also want to recognize it's the end of our time as well, but maybe there's a quick way of asking and responding to it.
Yes, I'll be quick. Thank you so much, Avis, for the remarkable story. You talked about Dr. Dumont spending 45 minutes with you and using co-regulation and his voice and his body and so on. I'm just curious about some examples of how he did that, how it was helpful.
Well, I can give you an example of a doctor who didn't do that. So again, I have, the impact of adverse childhood experiences. I have a lot of chronic health problems, and I got referred to a specialist. And when I went to that specialist, he was so cold. He didn't smile. His face looked angry. His body language was closed off. And the way that he presented himself was like just irritated and like angry. And because of that, my nervous system shut down. I don't feel safe around this person. I don't like this person, and I'm not going to listen to what he has to say. And I didn't take the medication that he prescribed. And as a result of that, my health condition got worse. So that's an example of somebody who doesn't have co-regulation. And when my nervous system didn't feel safe, I didn't trust him. So basically Dr. Dumont is like the opposite of that. Smiles, offers a gentle sort of tone of voice, and body language being very very welcoming, like not closed off and distant, but like engaged. And it was really the words he was saying, I think, the words and those signals of safety and connection, just wasn't focused on trying to fix or solve anything, but just holding space for me and helping me to know that I wasn't alone.
Thank you. That's helpful. Thank you very much.
And thank you, everybody. And we recognize that we've come to the end of our time here. So we want to officially close our time. I know I'm happy to stick around for a few moments. These informal conversations are always so powerful. So yeah, just want to let people know that it's time to end our time together. So I'm not sure, Josh, if you were going to say a few words in closing as well.
Yeah, I think more than anything else, Harley and Avis, just gratitude for the stories that were shared. Both Harley, you leading us to this work, and Avis just sharing. And as I watch the chat go through, there's just so much gratitude for your vulnerability and strength, for your ability to share the story and inspire the rest of us. And so I just really appreciate what you were able to share. I acknowledge some of the things that you've learned, non-external or externalizing the diagnosis, and some of the calls to action that you shared on your last slide, I just think is so powerful for us to learn. And I totally appreciate, and I know Michael Dumont as a fantastic both clinician but also just person, and so completely appreciate your time, completely appreciate all of your time tonight who have joined us. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us. There will be offers for sessional payments tonight, which I will quickly put in the chat, so those of you are able to then get that to happen. There will also be an evaluation form at the end, so as you log out, you'll be asked to do the evaluation. We will very much invite you back on January 12th for another event. And so this will be the third of the 5-part series. Continue to hear, I think next time is Raul and Dana, or Dr. Gupta and Dr. Hubler, who will be sharing, and to continue to appreciate the time, the effort. I want to acknowledge again, the people that are around this table, the ones that continue to have conversation. And I challenge each of you to have these conversations outside the 58 people that were here tonight, and continue to share the stories. You've now witnessed one story, and so continue to give you an opportunity to share, invite more, watch the videos, and please come back in January.
Awesome.
With
And
that,
if there's time, I'd like to share close with a song, if that's okay.
please. Absolutely.
So this is a song that also comes from the Ligwith and it's and no worries if people have to go. I understand it's yeah, so feel free to leave if you'd like. But I wanted to close with the Ligwith Umlala, which is a celebration song. And it's a song to celebrate. We would sing it after a potlatch and be dancing and singing to celebrate who we are. So celebrating each and every one of you for being a part of this conversation today. I know some of those things are not comfortable. These are not comfortable conversations, but just celebrating each and every one of you. And I also like the English translation of Ligwith is unkillable sea serpent. So it's a supernatural sea worm that lives in the ocean that can't be destroyed. If you cut it in half, it won't die, but it'll continue multiplying and growing new heads. And I like thinking about that in terms of the genocide. That's a little person. The genocide that Indigenous people have experienced, and that it didn't work. We're still here, and we will continue to be here. So this is the Ligwith celebration song. Anano, 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 oh, yeah, anano, oh, anano, Ligwith oh, we were kai kasawa anano oh yeah anano 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 oh yeah anano oh Well, thank you, everyone. It was an honor to share time and space, and Hopefully our paths will cross at another time.
Thank you very much, Avis.
I'm done now.
Hi, little Avis.
Yeah, I duplicated myself.
Always humbling to see yourself replicated in someone else.
Ah.